The rain came down like bullets against the windows of Rosie's diner, each drop a small percussion in the symphony of a November storm that had settled over Newark like a curse. Grace Mitchell stood behind the counter, a coffee pot in one hand and a dish towel in the other, watching the water streak down the glass in rivulets that blurred the neon signs across the street into abstract paintings of red and blue. It was nearly 10 p.m. on a Wednesday, and the diner was almost empty, just how she liked it. "More coffee, sweetie?" she asked the elderly man in booth 3, her voice carrying that practiced warmth that waitresses perfected over years of service. He nodded without looking up from his newspaper, and Grace moved with the kind of economy that came from doing the same motions thousands of times. She was 28 years old, though most people would have guessed older. There was something in her eyes, a hardness, a distance, that aged her beyond her years. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore no makeup except for a touch of lipstick that Rosie, the diner's owner, insisted was mandatory. "We're selling more than just eggs and coffee," Rosie always said. "We're selling comfort." But Grace wasn't selling anything. She was waiting. 3 years. 3 years, 2 months, and 17 days since Tommy died. She could still see him sometimes. In the spaces between customers, in the quiet moments when the kitchen went silent and the only sound was the hum of the refrigerator. Tommy, with his crooked smile and his ridiculous optimism, always believing that people were fundamentally good, that the world would eventually bend toward justice if you just kept pushing. He'd been 22 when they killed him. Just a kid, really, who'd gotten mixed up in something he didn't understand. A courier job, that's all it was supposed to be. Easy money to help pay for his college tuition. He'd wanted to be a teacher of all things. Elementary school. He loved kids, loved the idea of shaping young minds. Instead, his mind, along with the rest of him, had been found in a dumpster behind a warehouse in Kearney. Grace's hand tightened around the coffee pot, and she had to consciously force herself to relax. The therapist she'd seen for exactly 3 sessions before quitting had called it maladaptive coping. Grace called it survival. The police had called it gang violence. Case closed. Another young man in the wrong place at the wrong time. Her parents, already fragile, had shattered completely. Her father retreated into silence and whiskey. Her mother into church and prescription pills. Grace had retreated into planning, because she knew something the police didn't or wouldn't acknowledge. Tommy's death wasn't random. It was an execution, and the man who'd ordered it was Vittorio Morelli. The name had come to her through whispers, through late-night conversations with Tommy's friends who were too scared to go to the police, through her own digging in the dark corners of the internet where organized crime was discussed in careful euphemisms. Morelli ran one of the most powerful operations in North Jersey. Gambling, loan sharking, labor racketeering, and rumor had it, a growing stake in the legitimate construction business. He was 42 years old, never married, no children. He lived in Manhattan now, in a penthouse overlooking Central Park, but his roots were in Newark, in the old Italian neighborhood that had mostly disappeared, but whose power structures remained. His father had been a boss before him, and his grandfather before that. Mafia royalty, if such a thing existed. And Tommy, sweet, naive Tommy, had delivered a package to the wrong address, or seen something he shouldn't have seen, or maybe just existed in the wrong moment. The details didn't matter. What mattered was that Vittorio Morelli had given the order, and Tommy had died, and Grace had spent the last 3 years becoming a ghost. She'd changed her last name, Mitchell instead of Conti. She'd cut her hair and dyed it darker. She'd moved from apartment to apartment, never staying anywhere long enough to form attachments. She'd taken self-defense classes and learned to shoot at a range in Pennsylvania where they didn't ask questions if you paid cash. She'd studied Morelli the way a hunter studies prey, his habits, his routines, his associates, and she'd waited for an opportunity. The bell above the diner door chimed, pulling Grace from her thoughts. She glanced up reflexively, her customer service smile already forming, and then froze. 3 men had entered, shaking rain from their expensive coats. The 2 in front were clearly muscle, broad-shouldered men in dark suits that didn't quite hide the bulk of shoulder holsters. They moved with the awareness of people trained in violence, their eyes scanning the diner with professional thoroughness. But it was the 3rd man who made Grace's heart stop. Vittorio Morelli. She'd seen hundreds of photos, watched hours of surveillance footage that she'd cobbled together from news reports and amateur videos, but nothing had prepared her for the reality of his presence. He was tall, over 6 feet, with dark hair that was graying at the temples and a face that belonged on Roman coins, sharp cheekbones, a strong jaw, and eyes that were almost black in the diner's fluorescent lighting. He wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Grace made in 6 months, and he moved with the casual confidence of a man who'd never had to worry about being refused anything. But there was something else too, a weariness around his eyes, a set to his shoulders that spoke of burdens carried for too long. Grace realized she was staring, and quickly looked down, her pulse hammering in her ears. This wasn't possible. Morelli never came to places like this. His world was upscale restaurants and private clubs, not run-down diners in forgotten neighborhoods. "Evening," one of the bodyguards said to Rosie, who'd emerged from the kitchen. "We need a booth in the back. Private." Rosie, who'd seen everything in her 40 years running the diner, simply nodded. "Booth 7, it's quiet back there." Grace kept her head down, busying herself with wiping the already clean counter. Her mind was racing. This was it, the opportunity she'd been waiting for. But she wasn't prepared. The gun she'd bought was at home, hidden in a shoebox under her bed. She had no plan, no exit strategy, and yet, some part of her whispered that she'd never have a better chance. "Miss?" Rosie's voice cut through her panic. "Table 7 needs service." Grace's head snapped up. Rosie was looking at her with concern, and Grace realized she must look as shaken as she felt. She forced herself to breathe, to school her features into professional neutrality. "Of course," she said, her voice steady despite everything. She picked up menus and a water pitcher, her hands moving on autopilot. As she approached booth 7, she could hear the low murmur of conversation. The 2 bodyguards had positioned themselves at a table nearby, their backs to the wall, watching the entrance. Morelli sat alone in the booth, looking at his phone. "Good evening," Grace said, and was impressed by how normal she sounded. "Can I start you with some coffee?" Morelli looked up, and for one terrible moment their eyes met. Grace felt naked under that gaze, certain that he could see right through her disguise to the vengeful sister beneath. But he simply nodded. "Please. Black. No sugar." His voice was different than she'd expected, cultured, with just a hint of the old Newark neighborhood in the vowels. Not the harsh rasp of movie mobsters, but something almost refined. Grace poured the coffee with steady hands, a skill honed through countless shifts. She set down the menus and turned to leave. "The special tonight," she heard herself say, "is meatloaf with mashed potatoes. It's good." Why had she said that? Why was she making recommendations to the man who'd murdered her brother? Morelli smiled, a small, tired expression. "That sounds perfect. Thank you." Grace nodded and walked away, her legs mechanical. When she reached the counter, she had to grip the edge to steady herself. Tommy's killer was sitting 20 feet away, drinking coffee and ordering meatloaf like any other customer. The next 30 minutes were torture. Grace prepared Morelli's food, refilled his coffee twice, and watched as he ate in silence, occasionally checking his phone but mostly just staring out the rain-streaked window. The bodyguards ordered nothing, just sat like statues watching the door. Around 11, the diner emptied completely except for Morelli's party. Even the old man in booth 3 had paid and left, grumbling about the weather. Rosie retreated to the kitchen to start cleaning, leaving Grace alone in the front. This was it. This was the moment. Grace's mind raced through possibilities. The kitchen had knives, large ones. There was a tire iron under the counter that Rosie kept for security. Grace was close enough that she could grab something, could strike before the bodyguards reacted. But then what? She'd be killed immediately, or arrested. Her parents would lose their only remaining child, and she'd never know for certain why Tommy had died, would never have the satisfaction of looking into Morelli's eyes and making him acknowledge what he'd taken from her. No, it had to be more than this. It had to mean something. "Check, please," Morelli called softly. Grace printed the bill and brought it over. As she set it down, Morelli looked up at her again, and this time his gaze lingered. "What's your name?" he asked. Grace's throat went dry. Grace, he repeated, as if tasting the word. "You're new here." It wasn't a question. Grace nodded anyway. 6 months. "You're good at this," Morelli said, gesturing vaguely at the diner, attentive without being intrusive. "That's rare." "Thank you," Grace managed. Morelli pulled out a money clip, actual cash, Grace noticed, not credit cards, and laid down several bills. Far more than the check required. "Keep the change," he said, standing. He was even taller up close, and Grace had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. For a moment they simply looked at each other. Grace felt something pass between them. Recognition, maybe, or curiosity. Then Morelli nodded, a formal gesture almost like a bow, and turned toward the door. His bodyguards fell into formation around him, and then they were gone, the bell chiming their exit. Grace stood frozen, staring at the empty booth. On the table, beneath the money clip, was a business card. Simple, cream-colored stock with just a name and a phone number. Vittorio Morelli. Her hands were shaking as she picked it up. Why had he left this? Did he know who she was? Was this some kind of game? Through the window, she could see Morelli getting into a black Mercedes, the bodyguards flanking him. The car pulled away, its taillights disappearing into the rain-soaked night. Grace realized she was crying, silent tears that she angrily wiped away. 3 years of planning, of waiting, and he'd been right there, and she'd served him meatloaf and smiled like a good little waitress. "You okay, hun?" Rosie emerged from the kitchen, concern etched on her weathered face. "Fine," Grace said automatically. "Just tired." Rosie looked unconvinced, but didn't push. "Why don't you head home? I'll finish up here." Grace nodded numbly. She went to the back room, changed out of her uniform and pulled on her jacket. The business card felt like it was burning a hole in her pocket. Outside, the rain had softened to a drizzle. Grace stood under the diner's awning, breathing in the cold November air. Across the street, she could see her reflection in a darkened storefront, a ghost of a woman, haunted by a ghost of a boy. She pulled out her phone and stared at Morelli's card. One call. That's all it would take. She could set up a meeting, could plan something better than a clumsy attack in a diner. She could look him in the eye and ask him why. Why Tommy? What had her brother done to deserve such a brutal end? But calling meant engaging, meant stepping into Morelli's world instead of striking from the shadows. It meant risk. Grace thought of Tommy's smile, of the way he'd believed in goodness, even in a world that had so little of it. She thought of her parents, shells of the people they'd been. She thought of the 3 years she'd spent becoming someone else, someone harder and colder, and capable of violence. And she thought of Morelli's eyes, those dark, weary eyes that had looked at her like she was a person, not just a waitress. She made a decision. Grace walked to her car, a 15-year-old Honda that she'd paid for in cash. But instead of getting in, she circled back to the alley behind the diner. She knew from her research that Morelli had a regular schedule of meetings, that he moved through the city in predictable patterns. And she knew that the Mercedes had turned left out of the parking lot, heading toward downtown Newark. Grace started walking, following the direction the car had taken. The rain soaked through her jacket, plastered her hair to her face, but she didn't care. Her hand found the small canister of pepper spray in her pocket. Not much, but something. She didn't have a plan. She was acting on instinct, on the rage that had sustained her for 3 years, on the desperate need to do something instead of nothing. 2 blocks ahead, she saw the Mercedes parked outside a closed furniture store. The bodyguards stood outside, smoking and talking in low voices, which meant Morelli was inside. Grace's heart hammered as she approached, staying in the shadows. The bodyguards were distracted, focused on their conversation. She could slip past them, could get into the building. And then what? But her feet kept moving, carrying her forward past the point of rational thought, into the territory of pure need. She needed to see him again, needed to confirm that he was real, that all of this was real, that Tommy's death had actually meant something to someone besides her. She rounded the corner of the building and found a back entrance, a metal door propped open with a brick. Through it, she could hear voices. Morelli's voice. Grace stepped inside. The furniture store was dark except for a single light in the back office. Grace moved through the maze of covered furniture like a ghost, drawn toward that light. And then she was there, standing in the doorway. Morelli sat behind a desk, talking on his phone. He was alone, his jacket off, his shirt sleeves rolled up. He looked younger somehow, less formal, more human. He glanced up and saw her. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other. Grace watched as surprise flickered across his face, followed by something else. Understanding, maybe, or resignation. Slowly, Morelli ended his call and set down the phone. "Grace," he said quietly, "I wondered when you'd come." And in that moment, Grace understood. He'd known. All along he'd known who she was. The rage that had sustained her for 3 years crystallized into a single burning point of hate. "You killed my brother," she said, her voice shaking. Morelli's expression didn't change. He simply nodded. "Yes," he said. "We need to talk about that." The words hung in the air between them like smoke, thick and poisonous. Grace felt her entire body trembling, every muscle coiled tight with 3 years of grief and fury compressed into this single moment. Behind her, she could hear the distant murmur of the bodyguards outside, oblivious to the confrontation unfolding in this forgotten furniture store. "We need to talk about that," Morelli had said, as casually as if he were discussing the weather. Grace's hand moved to her pocket, fingers closing around the pepper spray canister. It wasn't what she'd imagined. She'd dreamed of having a gun, of the weight and finality of it. But it would have to do. She could blind him, hurt him, make him feel even a fraction of the pain she'd carried. "Talk?" The word came out as a hiss. "You want to talk about how you murdered my brother? About how you had Tommy killed like he was nothing?" Morelli stood slowly, his hands visible, palms open. The gesture was almost theatrical in its deliberateness, as if he were trying to gentle a wild animal. "I know you're armed with something, and I know you've been planning this for a long time. But before you do whatever you came here to do, give me 5 minutes. Just 5 minutes to explain." "Explain what?" Grace took a step forward, her vision blurring with tears she refused to shed. "There's nothing to explain. Tommy was 22 years old. He was going to be a teacher. He had his whole life ahead of him, and you took it away because... Why? Because he saw something he shouldn't have? Because he was in the wrong place? Because his life meant nothing to people like you?" Something flickered across Morelli's face. Pain, maybe, or regret. But Grace didn't want to see his humanity. She needed him to be a monster. Monsters were easier to hate. "Your brother's death was not supposed to happen," Morelli said quietly, "and I've spent the last 3 years trying to make it right." "Make it right?" Grace laughed, a sharp, broken sound. "You can't make it right. You can't bring him back. You can't give my parents back their son, or give me back my brother, or undo any of the—" Her voice broke. She hated herself for that weakness, for letting him see her pain. Morelli moved slightly, reaching toward his desk. Grace's hand tightened on the pepper spray, her body tensing. "Easy," Morelli said. "I'm just getting something to show you." He pulled open a drawer and extracted a thick manila folder, setting it on the desk between them. Grace didn't move to take it, didn't take her eyes off his face. "What is that?" she demanded. "The truth," Morelli replied. "About what happened to Tommy. About who gave the order, and about what I've done since." Grace wanted to refuse, wanted to spray him and run and never look back. But curiosity, that dangerous, treacherous thing, made her hesitate. Morelli seemed to sense her wavering. "Grace, I know who you are. I've known since the first time you applied to work at restaurants in my territory. I've had people watching you, making sure you stayed safe." The words hit her like a physical blow. "You've been watching me? Protecting you," Morelli corrected. "There are people in my organization who would have killed you the moment they realized you were Tommy Conti's sister. People who see you as a loose end, a potential threat. I've kept them away from you. I don't need your protection." Grace spat, even as her mind reeled. He'd known. All this time, every careful step she'd taken, every precaution, and he'd been watching her like she was a child playing at revenge. "No," Morelli agreed. "You needed justice, and I haven't been able to give you that. Not yet." He pushed the folder toward her. "Look at it, please. Then decide what you want to do." Grace stood frozen for a long moment, every instinct screaming at her to run, to attack, to do anything but engage with this man. But Tommy's face swam in her memory, his trusting eyes, his stupid optimism, and she found herself reaching for the folder. The first page was a photograph, a man in his 50s, heavy-set, with cold eyes and a cruel mouth. Grace didn't recognize him. "Marco Santini," Morelli said, his voice taking on a hard edge. "My second in command. Or he was, until I started to suspect what he'd done." Grace flipped through more pages, surveillance photos, financial records, transcripts of recorded conversations. Her hands moved mechanically, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. Tommy was supposed to deliver a package to a legitimate business contact, Morelli continued. Construction permits, actually. Boring paperwork. But Marco had his own agenda. He was trying to take over certain operations and he needed to create chaos to do it. He rerouted Tommy to a location where a rival crew was operating, knowing Tommy would be caught in the crossfire. Grace looked up sharply. Crossfire? Tommy's death was meant to look like gang violence, Morelli said, and now she could hear the anger in his voice. Carefully controlled but present. Random. Meaningless. It was supposed to spark a war between organizations, which would have given Marco the opportunity to consolidate power, while everyone else was distracted. "You're lying," Grace whispered. But even as she said it, she was remembering details from the police report. The location where Tommy's body had been found. The weapon used, a 9mm that had been linked to a crew from Elizabeth, not Newark. The timing, right in the middle of a territorial dispute that had since fizzled out. "I'm not," Morelli said simply. "I didn't know what Marco had done until 6 months after Tommy died. By then, the trail had gone cold, but I've been building a case against him ever since. Carefully, quietly, because Marco is smart and connected, and if I move against him without absolute proof, it could tear apart everything my family has built." Grace sank into the chair across from the desk, her legs suddenly unable to support her. "Why should I believe you? You could have fabricated all of this." "I could have," Morelli acknowledged. "But why would I? If I wanted you dead, Grace, you would have died 3 years ago. If I wanted to silence you, I had 100 opportunities. Instead, I kept you alive. I made sure you were safe. And I left you my card tonight because I knew you'd follow me. I knew you were finally ready to make your move, and I wanted to be ready to tell you the truth." "The truth," Grace repeated bitterly. She looked down at the folder at the face of Marco Santini. "So what? You want me to kill him instead? Is that what this is? You're redirecting my revenge?" "No," Morelli said sharply. "I don't want you anywhere near Marco. He's dangerous and he's paranoid, and if he even suspects that you know what he did, he'll kill you without hesitation." "Then what do you want?" Grace demanded, looking up at him. "Why tell me any of this? Why not just handle it yourself?" Morelli was quiet for a moment, his dark eyes searching her face. "Because you deserve to know the truth. Because I've watched you destroy yourself with grief and rage for 3 years, and I couldn't let it continue. And because—" He trailed off, seeming to struggle with something. "Because?" Grace pressed. "Because your brother's death is on me," Morelli said finally. "Not directly, but it happened because of my organization, because of the world I operate in. And I've carried that guilt every day since I found out. I owed it to Tommy, and to you, to make it right." Grace stared at him, trying to reconcile the man in front of her with the monster she'd built in her mind. This was supposed to be simple. He was supposed to be evil, irredeemable, someone she could hate without complication. But he looked tired, sad, human. "I still want to kill you," she said, and was surprised to find she meant it even now. Morelli nodded slowly. "I know, and maybe you should. Maybe that would be justice. But Grace, killing me won't bring Tommy back. It won't ease your pain. It'll just add my death to your burden." "Don't," Grace said sharply. "Don't pretend you're concerned about me. You don't get to do that." "You're right," Morelli agreed. "I don't, but I am anyway." The admission hung between them, raw and uncomfortable. Grace looked away first, her eyes burning. She wanted to hate him. She needed to hate him. But the foundations of her rage were cracking, and she didn't know what would be left if they crumbled completely. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. "Now," Morelli said, "you have a choice. You can walk away. I'll make sure you're protected, that Marco never knows you exist. You can go back to your life, or start a new one. Or, Grace looked up, or you can help me take Marco down. You can be part of getting real justice for Tommy." Grace laughed harshly. "Help you help the Mafia? That's insane." "Yes," Morelli agreed. "It is. But it's also the only way you're going to get the closure you need. The only way Tommy's death will mean something." "It already means something," Grace said fiercely. "It means that people like you destroy innocent lives for profit and power. It means that my brother died because he was good and trusting in a world full of predators." "Yes," Morelli said again, and there was such sorrow in his voice that Grace felt something crack inside her chest. "That's exactly what it means, and I can't change that. But I can make sure the man responsible pays for it, with your help, or without it." Grace stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. "I need to think." "Of course," Morelli said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a phone. A burner, by the looks of it, cheap and disposable. "This is clean. My number is the only one programmed in. Call me when you decide." Grace took the phone mechanically, shoving it into her jacket. She needed to get out of here, needed air and space and time to process everything that had just happened. She turned toward the door, then stopped. "That night, when you came to the diner, you came there specifically to see me, didn't you?" "Yes," Morelli admitted. "I wanted to see who you'd become, if you were really ready to follow through." "And?" Grace asked, not sure why she wanted to know. "And you're stronger than I expected," Morelli said softly. "But you're also still human. still capable of something other than hate. That's good, Grace. Don't lose that. Grace didn't respond. She walked through the darkened furniture store, past the shrouded chairs and tables, and out into the rain-soaked alley. The bodyguards were still out front, oblivious. She walked for blocks, her mind churning. Everything she'd believed for 3 years had been upended in the space of 20 minutes. Tommy's death wasn't random, but it also wasn't ordered by the man she'd sworn to kill. There was another villain, another target, and Morelli, Vittorio, had known who she was all along, had protected her, had apparently felt guilt over Tommy's death, even though he hadn't directly caused it. Grace found herself at a small park, empty at this hour, and sank onto a bench beneath a broken streetlight. She pulled out the burner phone and stared at it. One call. That's all it would take to set herself on a new path, to trade the simple clarity of revenge for the murky complexity of justice. But what choice did she really have? She could walk away, try to rebuild some semblance of a normal life, but she'd never know if Morelli was telling the truth. She'd never see Marco Santini pay for what he'd done. Tommy's death would remain forever unresolved, a wound that would never heal. Or she could do the unthinkable. She could ally herself with a mafia boss to take down his second-in-command. She could step fully into the darkness she'd been circling for 3 years. Grace thought of Tommy again, of his laugh and his dreams and the way he'd always seen the best in people. What would he want her to do? Would he want her to risk her life for revenge? Would he want her to become the kind of person who could partner with criminals? But then, Tommy was dead, and the dead didn't get to weigh in on the choices of the living. Grace's finger hovered over the call button. Dawn was still hours away, and the rain showed no signs of stopping. In a few hours, she'd have to go to work at the diner, serve coffee, and smile at customers and pretend to be the normal woman she'd never been. Or she could become something else entirely. She pressed the button. Morelli answered on the first ring. "Grace, I want to see proof," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Everything you have on Marco, every piece of evidence, and I want to know exactly what your plan is." There was a pause and then, "When?" "Tomorrow night. The diner closes at 11. Come alone." "Grace?" "Alone," she repeated. "Or this conversation is over." Another pause. "All right. Alone." Grace ended the call and sat in the rain, watching the city lights blur through the water on her lashes. She'd crossed a line tonight, one she couldn't uncross. She was no longer just Tommy's grieving sister. She was something new, something dangerous, and somewhere in the distance, she could almost hear her brother's voice, soft and sad. "Grace, what are you doing?" But Grace didn't have an answer. Not yet. She stood and walked back toward her car, the burner phone heavy in her pocket like a stone. Tomorrow night, she'd meet with a killer to plan the downfall of another killer. She'd step fully into a world she'd only ever observed from the shadows. And maybe, finally, she'd find out if justice and revenge were really different things at all. The diner was different at midnight. Without the clatter of dishes and the hum of conversation, it became almost cathedral-like in its silence. Grace sat in booth 7, the same booth where Vittorio Morelli had ordered meatloaf just 24 hours earlier, and watched the street through rain-streaked windows. She'd sent Rosie home early, claiming she wanted to catch up on inventory. Rosie had looked at her strangely, but hadn't argued. After 15 years of running a diner in Newark, Rosie had learned when not to ask questions. Now Grace was alone, a cup of coffee cooling in front of her untouched. She'd positioned herself facing the door, her back to the wall, an old habit from her self-defense instructor, a grizzled ex-cop who'd told her that awareness was the first line of defense. The burner phone sat on the table beside her coffee cup. She'd spent the day in a fog, going through the motions at work while her mind replayed the previous night's conversation. Every time she convinced herself that Morelli was lying, manipulating her, she'd remember the weariness in his eyes, the genuine regret in his voice. But guilt didn't equal innocence, and regret didn't bring back the dead. At 11:47 p.m., headlights swept across the diner's windows. A black Mercedes, not the same one from last night, Grace noted, but similar, pulled into the parking lot. Grace's heart hammered as she watched Morelli emerge from the driver's seat, alone. As promised, he wore dark jeans and a leather jacket over a simple black shirt. Without the expensive suit, he looked younger, less formal, more like someone you might pass on the street without a second glance, except for his eyes, those dark, assessing eyes that missed nothing. Grace stood and unlocked the door, stepping back to let him enter. For a moment, they simply looked at each other. Grace was acutely aware that she was completely alone with a man who'd built his life on violence, no matter how civilized his exterior. "Thank you for seeing me," Morelli said quietly. Grace locked the door behind him and gestured to booth 7. "Sit. I'll get coffee." "Grace, sit," she repeated more firmly. She needed the mundane ritual of pouring coffee, the familiar movements to steady her nerves. When she returned to the booth with 2 cups, Morelli was examining the diner with what looked like genuine interest. "How long has this place been here?" he asked. "Since 1962, Grace said, sliding into the seat across from him. "Rosie's father built it. She took over when he died." Morelli nodded slowly. "There used to be a place like this in the old neighborhood. My grandfather would take me there every Sunday after church. Best pancakes in Newark." "I don't care about your childhood memories," Grace said flatly. "You said you had proof. Show me." Something flickered across Morelli's face. Hurt, maybe, or disappointment. But he reached into his jacket and pulled out a tablet. He unlocked it and slid it across the table to Grace. "Everything's here," he said. "Financial records showing Marco's unauthorized transactions. Surveillance footage of him meeting with the crew from Elizabeth. Phone records linking him to the warehouse where Tommy was killed. And recordings. Conversations where Marco discusses the operation." Grace's hands trembled slightly as she picked up the tablet. The first file was a spreadsheet, columns of numbers that meant nothing to her. But Morelli leaned forward, his finger tracing down the screen. "Here," he said. "March 15th, 3 years ago, 2 weeks before Tommy died. Marco authorized a payment of $50,000 to a man named Vincent Caruso. Caruso runs a crew out of Elizabeth, small time but violent. The payment was supposed to be for a legitimate construction project, but if you look here," he swiped to another screen showing what appeared to be building permits and contracts. "The project doesn't exist. The address is a vacant lot. The permits were forged. Marco paid Caruso to stage a hit that would look like it came from a rival organization." Grace stared at the documents, her mind racing. This could still be fabricated. "It could," Morelli agreed. "So look at this." He took the tablet and pulled up a video file. The footage was grainy, clearly from a security camera, and showed 2 men sitting in a car. Grace recognized Marco Santini from the photo she'd seen. The other man was younger, with a shaved head and visible tattoos. "That's Caruso," Morelli said. "This was taken 3 days before Tommy died. Watch." He pressed play. There was no audio, but the body language was clear. Marco handing over an envelope, Caruso counting what was presumably money, both men nodding in agreement. "Could be anything," Grace said, but her voice lacked conviction. Morelli pulled up another file. "This is from Caruso's phone. We got it 6 months ago when one of his crew turned informant." A text message thread appeared on screen. Grace's breath caught as she read them. "Marco, package will be at the warehouse on the 29th. Make it look random." Caruso, "How random?" Marco, "Messy. Needs to look like your guys lost control. Territory dispute." Caruso, "Extra for this kind of work." Marco, "Done. Just make sure it can't come back to me." The date stamp showed March 26th, 3 days before Tommy died. Grace felt like she was falling, the diner spinning around her. "The package," she whispered. "That was Tommy. He was the package." "Yes," Morelli said, and his voice was heavy with something that sounded like genuine sorrow. "Marco knew Tommy was making deliveries for us. He rerouted him to that warehouse knowing Caruso's crew would be there, knowing it would go bad. But why?" Grace looked up, her vision blurring. "Why Tommy? He was nobody. He didn't know anything." "That's exactly why," Morelli said. "Tommy was clean, innocent. His death would look random, senseless, just another kid caught in gang violence. It wouldn't point back to our organization or to Marco specifically, and it would create the chaos Marco needed." Grace set down the tablet, her hands shaking too badly to hold it. "Show me more. Show me everything." For the next hour, Morelli walked her through his evidence. Audio recordings of Marco discussing the operation with his confidants. Financial trails showing how he'd been siphoning money from the organization for years. Testimony from the informant who'd confirmed Marco's involvement. With each piece of evidence, Grace felt the foundations of her rage shifting. For 3 years, she'd focused every ounce of her hatred on Vittorio Morelli. She'd studied him, learned his patterns, planned his death, and all that time, the real killer had been someone she'd never heard of until last night. "Why haven't you moved against him?" Grace asked finally. "You have all this evidence. Why is Marco still alive?" Morelli leaned back against the booth. his expression troubled. Because Marco is smart. He spent years building alliances both inside and outside the organization. If I move against him without absolute certainty, without unanimous support from the other families, it could spark a war. People would die. A lot of people. So you're just letting him get away with it? Grace felt anger flaring again, hot and familiar. You're protecting a murderer because it's inconvenient to deal with him? I'm being strategic, Morelli corrected sharply. There's a difference. I've been systematically dismantling Marco's support structure, turning his allies against him, building an airtight case. In another month, maybe 2, I'll have everything I need to move against him decisively. Another month, Grace repeated bitterly. How convenient. And what am I supposed to do for another month? Just wait while my brother's killer walks free? Yes, Morelli said bluntly. Because if you do anything rash, you'll get yourself killed and destroy any chance of real justice for Tommy. Grace stood abruptly, the booth suddenly feeling too small, too confining. She paced to the counter, gripping its edge. You don't get to tell me what to do. You don't get to decide what justice looks like for my family. She heard Morelli stand, felt him approach. He stopped a few feet away, giving her space but close enough that she could feel his presence. You're right, he said quietly. I don't. But Grace, I'm asking you to trust me just for a little longer. Let me finish what I started. Trust you? Grace laughed harshly. You're a criminal. You hurt people for a living. Why the hell would I trust you? Because I'm the only one who can get you what you want, Morelli said. And there was steel beneath the gentleness now. I'm the only one with the resources, the access, the authority to make Marco pay. You can hate me all you want, I probably deserve it, but you need me. Grace turned to face him, her eyes blazing. Maybe I don't need Marco to pay through official channels. Maybe I just need him dead. And you think you can kill him? Morelli asked, his expression unreadable. Marco has bodyguards, security systems, paranoia that borders on clinical. He doesn't go anywhere without protection. You'd never get close enough. I got close to you, Grace pointed out. Because I let you, Morelli said simply. I wanted you to find me. Marco won't extend the same courtesy. They stared at each other, the tension crackling between them like static electricity. Grace wanted to argue, to push back against his logic, but she knew he was right. She'd spent 3 years planning to kill one man and hadn't even gotten close to executing that plan. What chance did she have against someone actively trying to stay alive? So what do you want from me? She asked finally. Why show me all this? Why involve me at all? Morelli was quiet for a moment, seeming to choose his words carefully. Because you deserve to be part of bringing Marco down. Because Tommy was your brother, and you've earned the right to see justice done. And because... He trailed off, looking almost uncertain for the first time since she'd met him. Because? Grace pressed. Because I've watched you for 3 years, Morelli said slowly. I've seen your strength, your determination, your refusal to give up even when it would have been easier. And I thought, I hoped, that when the time came, you might be willing to help me make this right. Help you how? Grace asked suspiciously. Marco trusts very few people, Morelli explained. But he has weaknesses, patterns. And right now, I need someone he doesn't know. Someone who isn't connected to any of the families. Someone who can get close to him in ways my people can't. Understanding dawned slowly. You want me to spy on him. I want you to help me gather the final pieces of evidence I need, Morelli corrected. Marco frequents certain establishments, restaurants, clubs, a gym in Hoboken, places where a new face wouldn't seem suspicious if you could. No, Grace said immediately. Absolutely not. I'm not becoming one of your operatives. I'm not asking you to become anything, Morelli said patiently. I'm asking you to help me finish what Marco started when he killed your brother. This is your chance to be part of taking him down, to see him pay with your own eyes. Grace wanted to refuse outright, to tell him to go to hell and take his dangerous schemes with him. But something held her back. The image of Marco Santini's cold eyes in those photographs, the text messages so casually ordering her brother's death, the 3 years of grief and rage that needed an outlet. I need time, she said finally, to think about this. Of course, Morelli said. But Grace, time is something we don't have much of. Marco's getting suspicious. He knows I've been investigating something. If he figures out what I know before I'm ready to move. What? Grace asked. What happens then? Then he makes his move first, Morelli said grimly. And a lot of people die, possibly including you, if he discovers I've been watching you. The word sent a chill down Grace's spine. She'd been so focused on her own mission of revenge that she hadn't considered the larger game being played around her. "How do I know this isn't all some elaborate manipulation?" she asked. "How do I know you're not using me for something else entirely?" Morelli reached into his pocket and pulled out a small flash drive. "Everything I showed you tonight is on here. Take it. Show it to the FBI, to a lawyer, to whoever you trust. Get a second opinion. I'll wait." Grace took the drive hesitantly. "And if I go to the police? Then Marco gets arrested instead of dealt with properly," Morelli said. "He'll have expensive lawyers, connections in the system. He might beat the charges or get a reduced sentence. Is that the justice you want for Tommy?" "What I want," Grace said slowly, "is for Tommy to be alive. Since I can't have that, I want the man responsible to suffer the way my family has suffered." "So do I," Morelli said, and the raw honesty in his voice made Grace's breath catch. "More than you know." They stood in silence for a moment, the diner's fluorescent lights humming overhead. Outside, the rain had finally stopped, leaving the streets gleaming and empty. "I had a brother too," Morelli said suddenly. "Younger than me. Antonio. He wanted to be a doctor of all things. He hated the family business, wanted nothing to do with it." Grace watched him carefully, sensing this was important. "He died when he was 23, Morelli continued, his voice distant. "Car accident, or that's what the police said. But I knew better. One of our rivals had rigged his brakes. They wanted to hurt my father, and Antonio was an easy target because he wasn't protected the way the rest of us were." "I'm sorry," Grace said, and was surprised to find she meant it. Morelli looked at her, his eyes full of old pain. "I was 28, the same age you are now, and I spent years wanting revenge, planning it, dreaming about it. When I finally got it, when the man responsible was dead, I thought I'd feel better. But I didn't. The hatred just turned inward, became this poison I carried around." "So what are you saying?" Grace asked. "That revenge is pointless? That I should just let this go?" "No," Morelli said firmly. "I'm saying that revenge and justice aren't the same thing. Revenge is for you. It's about your pain, your anger. Justice is about making sure what happened to Tommy doesn't happen to someone else. About removing a dangerous man from power before he can hurt more people." Grace absorbed this, turning it over in her mind. "You're asking me to think bigger than just Tommy. I'm asking you to honor Tommy by doing something that matters," Morelli said, "by being part of something larger than just your grief." It was a compelling argument, Grace had to admit, and looking at Morelli now, really looking at him, past her preconceptions and hatred, she saw a man carrying his own burdens, his own griefs, a man who'd lost someone he loved to senseless violence and had spent years trying to prevent it from happening again. She still didn't trust him, but maybe, just maybe, she could work with him. "If I agree to this," Grace said slowly, "I have conditions." "Name them," Morelli replied immediately. "First, I want access to everything. Every piece of evidence, every plan, every step of the operation. No secrets." Morelli nodded. "Done." "Second, when you move against Marco, I want to be there. I want to see his face when he realizes he's been caught. That could be dangerous," Morelli warned. "I don't care. That's the condition." "All right," Morelli agreed. "What else?" "And third," Grace said, her voice hardening, "when this is over, you leave me alone. No more watching, no more protection, no more involvement in my life. We settle the debt between us and then we're done." Something painful flickered across Morelli's face, but he nodded. "If that's what you want." "It is," Grace said firmly, even as something in her chest tightened at the thought. Morelli extended his hand across the counter. "Then we have a deal." Grace stared at his hand for a long moment. This was it, the point of no return. If she shook his hand, she was committing to a path that would take her deep into a world she'd only ever observed from the outside. She'd be working with criminals to take down another criminal. She'd be betraying everything she thought she believed about right and wrong, but she'd also be honoring Tommy. She'd be making sure his death meant something. Grace reached out and took Morelli's hand. His grip was firm and warm, his palm slightly calloused. They shook once, formal as a business transaction. "When do we start?" Grace asked. A small smile crossed Morelli's face, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him. "Tomorrow. I'll pick you up after your shift. We have a lot of work to do." He released her hand and stepped back. For a moment they simply looked at each other, and Grace felt the weight of what they'd just agreed to settle over them both. "Grace," Morelli said as he turned toward the door, "thank you for trusting me even a little. I know what it cost you." Grace didn't respond. She watched him leave, the bell chiming his exit, and then she was alone again in the silent diner. She looked down at the flash drive in her hand, then at the tablet still sitting in booth 7. Evidence of murder and betrayal, of plans within plans, of a world far more complicated than she'd ever imagined. And somewhere in her memory, Tommy's voice whispered, "Be careful, Grace. Don't lose yourself in this." But maybe, Grace thought as she began cleaning up, she'd already been lost for 3 years. Maybe this was her chance to find herself again, not as Tommy's grieving sister, but as someone capable of making hard choices and seeing them through. She locked up the diner and walked to her car, the flash drive heavy in her pocket. Tomorrow, her real education would begin. Tomorrow, she'd step fully into Vittorio Morelli's world, and she'd either emerge with justice for her brother, or she'd be destroyed in the attempt. Either way, there was no turning back now. The penthouse overlooked Central Park like a kingdom surveying its domain. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed Manhattan stretched out below, a glittering tapestry of lights against the November darkness. Grace stood at the glass, her reflection ghostly and uncertain, while behind her Vittorio Morelli moved through the space with the easy familiarity of someone completely at home. It had been 3 days since their agreement in the diner. 3 days of Grace being pulled deeper into a world she'd only ever imagined from the outside. "Coffee?" Morelli asked from the open kitchen, and Grace was struck again by the cognitive dissonance of watching a mafia boss operate an espresso machine with the precision of a barista. "Please," she said, turning away from the window. The penthouse was not what she'd expected. She'd imagined something ostentatious, marble and gold, the cliché of new money trying too hard. Instead, the space was surprisingly understated. Hardwood floors, comfortable furniture in neutral tones, bookshelves lined with actual books that looked read rather than decorative, art on the walls that seemed chosen for personal meaning rather than investment value. "You look surprised," Morelli observed, carrying 2 small cups to the dining table where he'd spread out files and photographs. "I expected something more," Grace gestured vaguely. "Gaudy?" Morelli supplied with a slight smile. "My father's house was like that. Every surface covered in proof of wealth. I hated it." He set down her coffee. "I wanted something that felt like a home, not a museum." Grace sat at the table, uncomfortable with these glimpses of Morelli's humanity. It was easier when he was just a target, a monster to be destroyed. These past 3 days had been steadily eroding that simple narrative. The first day, he'd taken her to a warehouse in Queens where his legitimate construction business operated. She'd watched him interact with workers, remembering names, asking about families, treating them with respect that seemed genuine rather than calculated. When a foreman raised concerns about safety equipment, Morelli had immediately authorized the purchase even though it would cut into profits. The second day had been meetings. Grace had sat silently in the corner of private rooms while Morelli conducted business with various associates. She'd watched him navigate complex negotiations, settle disputes, make decisions that affected dozens of lives, and she'd seen the fear in people's eyes when they looked at him, the deference that came from knowing he could destroy them with a word. Now, on the third day, they were finally focusing on Marco Santini. "These are Marco's regular locations," Morelli said, spreading photographs across the table. "This restaurant in Little Italy, Bella Notte, he has dinner there every Tuesday. This gym in Hoboken, he works out there most mornings around 6. And this social club in Newark, he plays cards there on weekends." Grace studied the images. "You want me to what exactly? Follow him around?" "I want you to become part of the landscape," Morelli explained. "The gym is easiest. You join, you work out the same time he does, you become a familiar face. After a while, people don't really see you anymore. You're just another person in their routine." "And then what?" Grace asked. "I eavesdrop on his conversations while he's on the treadmill?" "Essentially, yes," Morelli said. "Marco is cautious, but he's also arrogant. He thinks he's untouchable. In environments where he feels safe, he talks. And I need to know what he's planning." Grace picked up one of the photographs. Marco leaving the gym, a towel around his neck, looking satisfied and prosperous. "What makes you think he's planning something?" Morelli's expression darkened. "Because he's been consolidating resources, moving money around, calling in favors, meeting with people he normally wouldn't associate with. He's preparing for something big." "Like what?" "Like a move against me," Morelli said bluntly. "I think he knows I'm investigating him, and I think he's planning to strike first." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Grace set down the photograph. You think he'll try to kill you? Yes, Morelli said simply, which is why we need to move faster than I'd planned. I need solid evidence of his current activities, something that will convince the other families to support my move against him. Without that support, if I kill Marco, it looks like a simple power play. There'll be retaliation, possibly war. Grace studied his face, looking for signs of fear or uncertainty, but Morelli seemed almost calm, as if he'd long ago accepted the possibility of his own death. Aren't you afraid? She asked. Morelli considered the question. Fear is a luxury I can't afford. The moment you show fear in this business, you're finished. People can smell it like blood in the water. That's not an answer, Grace pressed. He looked at her for a long moment, something shifting in those dark eyes. Yes, he said finally. I'm afraid. I've been afraid every day since my brother died, since I realized that everything I do, every decision I make, could get someone killed. But fear doesn't change what needs to be done. Grace understood that. She'd been afraid for 3 years, afraid of her own capacity for violence, afraid of what she might become in pursuit of revenge, afraid that even if she succeeded, the emptiness inside her would remain. Tell me about Antonio, she said suddenly. Morelli looked surprised. What? Your brother. You mentioned him the other night, but you didn't really talk about him. Tell me about him. For a moment, Grace thought he'd refuse. Then Morelli leaned back in his chair, his gaze distant. Antonio was light, he said softly. That's the only way I can describe it. In a family that dealt in darkness, he was somehow untouched by it. He believed in things, justice, redemption, the possibility of change. Our father thought he was weak. I thought he was the strongest person I'd ever known. Grace felt something twist in her chest. The description could have been about Tommy. He used to volunteer at a free clinic in the Bronx, Morelli continued. Even after he started medical school, he'd spend his weekends there, treating people who couldn't afford care. He said that's what medicine was supposed to be, helping people, not making money. He sounds like Tommy, Grace said quietly. Morelli's eyes focused on her. Yes, I thought the same thing when I learned about your brother. That's why I've been so invested in this. Because I failed Antonio. I couldn't protect him. But maybe I could do something for Tommy even if it was too late. Is that why you've been protecting me? Grace asked. Some kind of penance? Maybe, Morelli admitted. At first. But then I started actually watching you, seeing how you kept going even when it would have been easier to break, how you channeled your grief into purpose instead of just destruction. And I thought that maybe Antonio would have liked you, would have approved of what you were trying to do, even if he'd have disapproved of how you planned to do it. Grace didn't know what to say to that. The conversation had drifted into territory that felt dangerous. Not physically, but emotionally. They were supposed to be allies of convenience, united by a common enemy. They weren't supposed to be sharing grief, finding common ground in loss. We should focus, she said, reaching for the photographs. Tell me more about the gym. If Morelli was disappointed by the deflection, he didn't show it. He pulled over a laptop and brought up surveillance footage. This is from last week. Watch Marco. See how he always uses the same machines, follows the same routine. He's a creature of habit. For the next hour, they reviewed footage and discussed strategy. Grace would join the gym tomorrow, establish a pattern of early morning workouts. She'd observe Marco from a distance, note who he talked to, what he discussed. Morelli would provide her with a device disguised as a phone case that would record conversations within a certain radius. What if he recognizes me? Grace asked. What if he knows you've been watching me and makes the connection? He won't, Morelli said with certainty. Marco doesn't pay attention to civilians. To him, people like you are just background noise. Invisible unless you get in his way. People like me? Grace repeated. You mean ordinary people, non-criminals? Yes, Morelli said, meeting her gaze steadily. People who haven't had their humanity corroded by this life. That's what makes you perfect for this, Grace. You still have that innocence, that normalcy. You can move through the world without raising suspicion because you genuinely are what you appear to be. A waitress, Grace said. A survivor, Morelli corrected. Someone strong enough to endure tragedy without letting it completely define you. Grace looked away, uncomfortable with the compliment. You don't know me well enough to say that, don't I? Morelli challenged gently. I've watched you for 3 years, Grace. I've seen how you take care of your parents even though they barely recognize you through their own grief. I've seen you be kind to customers even when you're exhausted. I've seen you push through every day when it would be easier to give up. That's not nothing. It's not enough, Grace said, her voice tight. I let Tommy down. I should have protected him. Should have stopped him from getting involved with people like... She cut herself off, but the implication hung between them. People like you. Tommy made his own choices, Morelli said quietly. You couldn't have stopped him any more than I could have stopped Antonio from volunteering in dangerous neighborhoods. People like them, good people. They don't think the way we do. They believe the world is fundamentally safe, that good intentions are enough, and sometimes that gets them killed. Is that supposed to make me feel better? Grace asked bitterly. No, Morelli said. It's supposed to make you understand that their deaths aren't about our failures. They're about a world that's crueler than people like them ever expected, and all we can do is try to make that world a little less cruel, one small action at a time. Grace felt tears threatening and angrily blinked them back. She stood, moving to the windows again, putting distance between herself and Morelli's uncomfortable truths. Why are you really doing this? She asked, her voice low. You could have killed Marco years ago. You have the power, the resources. Why go through all this elaborate planning? Why involve me? She heard Morelli stand, felt him approach. He stopped beside her at the window, both of them reflected in the glass like ghosts. Because I'm tired of solving problems with violence, he said. Because every person I kill takes something from me, makes me a little less human, and because I hoped, that maybe there was another way, a cleaner way that doesn't just perpetuate the cycle. You're still going to kill him, Grace pointed out. Marco, when this is over. Yes, Morelli admitted. Some men are too dangerous to let live, but I want it to be justice, not just revenge. I want the other families to see that he betrayed the code, that his death is earned. That matters in my world. Honor among thieves, Grace said. Something like that, Morelli agreed. It's not perfect, and I know how it sounds to someone outside this life, but it's the best I can do. They stood in silence, watching the city below. Grace was acutely aware of Morelli beside her, his height, his warmth, the way his presence somehow made her feel both more vulnerable and more protected. I should go, she said, but didn't move. You could stay, Morelli said quietly. It's late and you have to be at the gym at 6 a.m. I have guest rooms. Grace turned to look at him, searching his face for ulterior motives. But he seemed sincere, his expression open. That wouldn't be appropriate, she said. Probably not, Morelli agreed. But it would be practical. Grace wanted to refuse, wanted to maintain the professional distance between them. But she was exhausted, physically from the long days, emotionally from the constant tension, and the thought of driving home alone, of lying awake in her apartment replaying everything, felt unbearable. Just sleep, she said firmly. Nothing else. Just sleep, Morelli confirmed. He showed her to a guest room that was larger than her entire apartment. The bed was enormous, covered in what felt like Egyptian cotton. There was an ensuite bathroom with a shower that had more settings than her car dashboard. There are clothes in the closet if you need them, Morelli said from the doorway. Toothbrush and anything else you might need in the bathroom. Help yourself to whatever you want. Whose clothes? Grace asked. No one's, Morelli said. I keep the guest room stocked for guests. Grace nodded, too tired to pursue the question. Thank you. Morelli hesitated, as if he wanted to say something more. Then he simply nodded. Good night, Grace. We'll leave at 5:30. He closed the door, and Grace was alone. She stood in the middle of the room, feeling dislocated and strange. 24 hours ago, she'd been serving breakfast at the diner. Now she was sleeping in a mafia boss's penthouse, preparing to spy on his second-in-command. Her life had become unrecognizable. Grace showered, letting the hot water ease muscles tight with tension. She found clothes in the closet, expensive workout gear, still tagged, in her size. Either Morelli was very good at guessing, or he'd been more prepared for this than he'd let on. She should have found that creepy. Instead, she found it almost reassuring, evidence of the thoroughness with which he'd watched her, protected her. Grace climbed into the enormous bed expecting to lie awake for hours. But exhaustion claimed her almost immediately, pulling her into a deep, dreamless sleep. She woke to darkness and confusion, her heart pounding. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was. Then memory returned. Morelli's penthouse, the guest room, the mission that awaited in a few hours. Grace checked her phone. 3:47 a.m. She'd been asleep for barely 4 hours, but she felt oddly rested. She should try to sleep more, but she was wide awake now, her mind already racing ahead to the day's tasks. She got up and padded to the door, opening it quietly. The penthouse was dark, except for a light from down the hall. Curious, Grace followed it to what appeared to be a study. Morelli sat at a desk, paperwork spread before him, a glass of whiskey at his elbow. He'd changed into sweatpants and a t-shirt, and he looked younger, less guarded. He didn't notice her at first, absorbed in whatever he was reading. Grace watched him for a moment, this man who'd become the center of her world so quickly. She still wasn't sure if she could trust him, but she was beginning to understand him. The weight he carried, the choices he made, the way he tried to be something more than what his world demanded. "Can't sleep?" Morelli said without looking up. Grace stepped into the room. "I slept, just not long." "Same," Morelli said, finally meeting her gaze. "I don't sleep much anymore. Too many variables, too many things that could go wrong." Grace moved closer, looking at the papers spread across his desk. Financial records, surveillance photos, notes in Morelli's precise handwriting. "Is this all about Marco?" "Most of it," Morelli confirmed. "I've been building this case for years. Every piece of evidence, every connection, every mistake he's made. It's almost complete. Just a few more pieces and we can move." "And then?" Grace asked. "And then we end this," Morelli said simply. "We get justice for Tommy. We remove a cancer from the organization, and we both try to move on with our lives." "Do you really believe that's possible?" Grace asked. "Moving on?" Morelli was quiet for a moment, swirling the whiskey in his glass. "I have to believe it. Otherwise, what's the point of any of this?" Grace sat in the chair across from his desk, drawing her knees up to her chest. "Tell me something. If you could go back, before Antonio died, before you were completely absorbed into this life, would you change things? Would you walk away?" Morelli considered the question seriously. "I used to think yes. I used to fantasize about a different life, going to college, becoming something legitimate, having a normal family. But now I think that everything I've been through, as painful as it's been, has made me who I am. And I like to think that who I am, despite everything, still matters. That I can still do some good, even from inside this darkness." "That's a very philosophical answer," Grace observed. "It's 3 a.m, Morelli said with a slight smile. "Everything's philosophical at 3 a.m. Grace found herself smiling back, and the ease of it surprised her. When had this happened? When had Vittorio Morelli stopped being just an enemy and started becoming something else? "Grace," Morelli said, his tone shifting to something more serious. "After tomorrow, things are going to move quickly. Marco is going to notice you eventually, and when he does, it could get dangerous. If at any point you want out, if you change your mind, I'll understand. I'll still move against Marco, and I'll still make sure you're protected. But you don't owe me anything. You can walk away." "I'm not going to walk away," Grace said firmly. "Even though it scares you?" Morelli asked. "Especially because it scares me," Grace replied. "I've spent 3 years being scared, being paralyzed by grief. This is the first time I've felt like I'm actually doing something, making a choice instead of just reacting. I'm not giving that up." Morelli studied her face in the dim light. "You're remarkable, you know that?" Grace felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I'm really not. I'm just stubborn." "No," Morelli said softly. "You're strong. There's a difference." The moment stretched between them, charged with something Grace didn't want to name. She stood abruptly, breaking the tension. "I should try to sleep some more. Early morning tomorrow." "Yes," Morelli agreed, but he didn't look away. Grace turned toward the door, then paused. "Vittorio?" It was the first time she'd used his first name, and she saw the impact of it in his eyes. "Thank you," she said, "for telling me the truth, for giving me a chance to be part of this. Thank you for trusting me enough to take it," Morelli replied. Grace nodded and left, returning to the guest room. But as she lay in the darkness, she found sleep elusive. Because something had shifted tonight, some fundamental change in how she saw Vittorio Morelli. He wasn't her enemy anymore, and that was more terrifying than any mission they could undertake. Because if he wasn't her enemy, what was he? And more importantly, what did that make her? The gym smelled of sweat and rubber, of effort and determination. Grace had been coming here for 2 weeks now, establishing herself as part of the morning routine. She'd learned the rhythm of the place, who used which machines, who chatted and who kept to themselves, the unspoken hierarchy of regulars versus newcomers, and she'd learned Marco Santini's patterns. He arrived every morning at 5:52 a.m., exactly 8 minutes before the hour. He started with stretching, then moved to weights, then cardio. He talked on his phone constantly, using a wireless earpiece that made him look like he was having conversations with himself. And he was arrogant, dismissive of the staff, condescending to other gym members, treating the space like his personal domain. Grace hated him more with each passing day. The recording device Vittorio had given her had captured dozens of conversations. Most were mundane, business discussions, personal calls, complaints about various associates. But 3 days ago, she'd gotten something significant. Marco had been on the treadmill talking to someone about the Morelli problem. Grace had been on the elliptical nearby, headphones in but music off, the recorder active in her phone case. "He's getting too close," Marco had said, his breathing heavy from exertion. "Whatever he knows, it's enough to make him cautious. We need to move now before he's ready." The voice on the other end had been inaudible, but Marco's responses painted a clear picture. "The restaurant, next Tuesday. He always meets with the Castellano family then, it's predictable. We hit him there, make it look like the Castellanos turned on him. It'll create enough chaos that no one will look too closely at who really ordered it." Grace had nearly fallen off the elliptical. They were planning to kill Vittorio in less than a week. Now, sitting in Vittorio's penthouse, a space that had become almost familiar over the past 2 weeks, Grace watched him listen to the recording for the third time. His face was impassive, but she'd learned to read the subtle signs of tension in his shoulders, the tightness around his eyes. "This is it," he said finally, stopping the playback. "This is what we needed." "What do we do?" Grace asked. Vittorio stood, moving to the windows where they'd stood together so many times. "I call a meeting with the other families. I present the evidence, all of it. I show them that Marco has been stealing, that he killed Tommy to cover his own power play, and that he's now planning to kill me and frame the Castellanos. They'll have no choice but to sanction his removal. And then," Grace pressed, "and then Marco Santini dies," Vittorio said simply. "Officially, with the blessing of every major family in the tri-state area." Grace should have felt satisfaction. This was what she'd wanted, justice for Tommy, Marco paying for his crimes. But instead she felt a hollow ache in her chest. "When?" she asked. "The meeting is tomorrow night," Vittorio said. "If it goes as planned, we move against Marco within 48 hours. "So it's almost over," Grace said softly. Vittorio turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "Yes, almost over. The words felt weighted with more than just the Marco situation. In 2 weeks, Grace and Vittorio had developed a rhythm, meetings every evening, discussions that ranged from strategy to philosophy, moments of surprising intimacy that neither acknowledged directly. Grace had learned that he read poetry, that he supported a scholarship fund in his brother's name, that he had a dry sense of humor that emerged when his guard was down. And she'd learned that she looked forward to seeing him each day with an intensity that had nothing to do with their mission. "What happens after?" Grace asked. "After Marco is dealt with?" Vittorio was quiet for a long moment. "You go back to your life. I honor our agreement, no more watching, no more involvement. You're free. And you?" Grace asked. "What do you do?" "I try to be better," Vittorio said. "I try to make the organization more legitimate, less violent. I try to honor Antonio's memory by being something more than just another criminal." Grace stood and walked to him, stopping just a few feet away. "That's not an answer. What do you want, Vittorio?" He looked at her, and Grace saw something raw in his eyes. Longing, fear, hope. "What I want doesn't matter. What I want is impossible." "Why?" Grace challenged. "Because I'm a killer, Grace," Vittorio said bluntly. "Because I've done things that would horrify you if you knew the details. Because you deserve someone clean and good, someone who doesn't carry the weight of dozens of deaths. Someone like Tommy would have been." "Don't," Grace said sharply. "Don't compare yourself to Tommy. You're not him, and I don't want you to be." "What do you want?" Vittorio asked, his voice rough. Grace stepped closer, close enough to feel his warmth. "I don't know. A month ago, I wanted you dead. 2 weeks ago, I wanted justice. Now I just want—" She stopped, unable to finish the sentence. Because what she wanted was impossible, wasn't it? She couldn't have feelings for Vittorio Morelli. He was everything she should despise. Violent, criminal, dangerous. The fact that he was also thoughtful and caring and burdened by conscience didn't change what he was, but it changed how she saw him. "Grace," Vittorio said softly, reaching out to touch her face. His hand was warm against her cheek, gentle in a way that contradicted everything he was. I've been trying so hard not to care about you, but I failed. Somewhere between watching you survive and watching you thrive, I fell in love with you. And I know that's wrong. I know I have no right. Grace kissed him. It was impulsive, desperate, a collision of need and fear and something she didn't want to name. Vittorio froze for a heartbeat, then pulled her closer, his arms wrapping around her like he could protect her from the world. From him. The kiss was everything Grace hadn't let herself imagine. Tender and fierce, familiar and new. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Grace felt tears on her cheeks. "This is crazy," she whispered. "Yes," Vittorio agreed, his forehead resting against hers. "I still don't fully trust you," Grace said. "I know," Vittorio replied. "And when this is over, I don't know if I can be part of your world," Grace continued. "I know that too," Vittorio said. "But Grace, whatever happens next, I need you to know that these past 2 weeks have been the most real, most human I've felt in years. You've reminded me that I'm more than just the role I play, and that's worth everything, even if this ends tomorrow." Grace pulled back slightly to look at his face. "It doesn't have to end, doesn't it?" Vittorio asked sadly. "You said yourself, when this is over, we're done. That was the condition." Grace thought of that conversation in the diner, of her certainty that she wanted nothing to do with Vittorio Morelli once justice was served. But that was before she'd really known him, before she'd seen the man behind the reputation. "Maybe I was wrong," she said quietly. Hope flickered in Vittorio's eyes, quickly suppressed. "Grace, think about what you're saying. Being with me means being part of this world. It means danger, secrecy, moral compromise. It means accepting things you've spent your life opposing." "I know," Grace said, "but it also means being with someone who understands loss, who's trying to be better despite everything. Someone who sees me, really sees me, not just as Tommy's sister or a waitress or a victim, but as myself." "I do see you," Vittorio said fiercely. "I see your strength and your compassion, and your refusal to be broken by tragedy. I see everything, Grace, and it's terrifying how much I want to keep seeing it." They stood holding each other, the Manhattan skyline glittering behind them, and Grace felt the weight of the choice before her. She could walk away after Marco was dealt with, return to her simple life, try to build something normal and safe, or she could leap into the unknown, into a relationship that defied logic and morality, with a man who was both dangerous and redemptive. "The meeting tomorrow," Grace said. "I want to be there." Vittorio pulled back. "Absolutely not. These are dangerous men, Grace. If anything went wrong, I need to be there," Grace insisted. "I need to see Marco's face when he realizes it's over. I need that closure, Vittorio. Don't deny me that." Vittorio searched her face, clearly torn. "You'll stay in the background. You won't speak, won't draw attention. If things turn violent, you run." "Agreed," Grace said. "And afterward," Vittorio said slowly, "after Marco is dealt with and Tommy has justice, we talk, really talk, about what this is between us, about whether it has any chance of working." "Okay," Grace agreed. "But Vittorio, I'm not making any promises about what I'll decide." "I'm not asking you to," Vittorio said. "I'm just asking for a chance." Grace kissed him again, softer this time, a promise of possibility rather than desperation. When she pulled away, she saw her own uncertainty reflected in his eyes. "Stay tonight," Vittorio said. "Not in the guest room. With me. I don't want to be alone, and I don't think you do either." Grace knew she should refuse, should maintain some boundaries. But the truth was, she didn't want to be alone either. She wanted to feel something other than the constant tension and fear that had defined the past weeks. "Just hold me," she said. "That's all I can handle right now. That's all I'm asking," Vittorio replied. They moved to his bedroom, a space Grace had never seen, surprisingly simple and unadorned. They lay together on top of the covers, fully clothed, wrapped in each other's arms. Vittorio's heartbeat was steady beneath Grace's ear, a rhythm that somehow eased her own anxiety. "Tell me about Tommy," Vittorio said softly. "Not about his death, about his life. What made him happy?" So Grace talked. She told stories about Tommy's terrible jokes, his love of old movies, the way he'd wanted to teach elementary school because he believed kids were still capable of genuine wonder. She talked until her voice grew hoarse, and through it all Vittorio listened, his hand stroking her hair. "He sounds like he was extraordinary," Vittorio said when she finished. "He was ordinary," Grace corrected. "That's what made him extraordinary. He was just a good person trying to do good things. The world should have more people like him. It has you, Vittorio pointed out. I'm not like Tommy, Grace said. I'm angry and vengeful and willing to partner with criminals for justice. You're human, Vittorio said. You're flawed and complicated and real. That's better than being a saint. Grace closed her eyes, exhaustion finally claiming her. Tomorrow changes everything. Yes, Vittorio agreed. But Grace, whatever happens, whatever you decide afterward, thank you for giving me this, for reminding me I'm capable of feeling something other than obligation and guilt. Thank you for seeing me, Grace whispered, already drifting toward sleep. She felt Vittorio's lips press against her forehead, gentle and reverent, and then she was asleep, dreamless and peaceful for the first time in years. Tomorrow would bring confrontation, resolution, and difficult choices, but tonight, Grace let herself simply exist in this moment, safe, seen, and surprisingly content in the arms of a man who should have been her enemy, but had somehow become something else entirely. The question of what that something was would have to wait. For now, this was enough.